Hey everyone, Zana here. So as some of you have probably noticed, I recently opened up to answering questions for some Q&A videos, giving everyone the opportunity to write in and ask questions that maybe they've been too scared to ask because they think they're dumb questions, or just anything in general that you want to know about this fishery, the gear, the setup, my store, anything like that. And I've been getting some really good questions. And while I did originally intend on making one big, video where I answered all of them, I'm now realizing that there's some questions that really deserve their own specific video. So that's what I'm doing here. So one of the questions that I seem to be getting a lot is, when is the right time for someone that starts out with a spin setup to switch to a fly setup? So most people, when they start out here on the river, start with a spinning reel and spinning rod, and that's how they go. And then I would say, at least half of them over a period of time decide to switch to a fly rod and reel setup. And there's no right or wrong way for either. There's no, better way or better setup, I guess. It really all depends on the person. So my answer to when the best time to switch is, or when someone should consider, it's really going to be up to the individual person and what their preferences are. So what I want to kind of do here today is just go over some of the advantages and disadvantages between each setup, and then hopefully that will help clear some things up and be able to let people make a decision based off of that information. So the first I want to talk about is going to be a spin setup, just because that's typically what most people start out with, because I think that's what people are familiar with. A lot of people grow up using reels like this in other types of fishing, so it's just an easier transition here on the river to start out using this. So some of the advantages of using a spin setup is it is more familiar. I mean, that's something that a lot of people are really comfortable with, and this river can be intimidating enough. So if that's something you're comfortable with and you have good success with it, there's really no reason to switch. I mean, if it's been working for you. Some of the other advantages on it are they come in models, spin reels come in models where you can have a 5-to-1 retrieve, 6-to-1 retrieve, 7, 8. And what that means is for each full rotation of the handle, your spool is being spun, either if it's 5-to-1, 5 times. So for every one turn of the handle, your spool would be spinning 5 times. For an 8-to-1 retrieve, for every one turn of the handle, it would be spinning 8 times. So what this does is actually allows you to retrieve your line faster. On a fly reel, most fly reels, unless you're looking at the old Martin 72s, are a 1-to-1 retrieve. So as you can see here, we're gonna look, the handle is attached to the spool. This right here, I'll show you. This is the whole spool. It comes apart and the handle is attached to it. So for every one turn of the handle to retrieve line, that's what you have. It's turning your spool one time as well. So it's a lot harder to get your line back in. When the fish takes out a ton of line, you're not going to be gaining ground as quickly on them. So that's kind of a disadvantage of a fly reel, and something that a lot of people do like about spinning reels. Now, on the flip side to that, with a spin reel, typically I don't want to say you don't have as much drag, but you definitely don't have as smooth of a drag as you do with fly reels, just because you really don't have the leverage that you do on a fly reel. Wish I had like a holder here or something, I could just grab them. So on a fly reel, especially the bigger you get, and on this river we typically use 7-8 weights, 8-9 weights, 9-10 weights, somewhere in there. So this one right here is a 7-8 weight, and you can get them as they go up in size. The spool actually gets bigger and bigger, And what that does is as it's taking line off, the bigger it is, you actually have more leverage. So it just keeps it smoother. As line's peeling off of this, it's very smooth. And sometimes when you get them wet, they do tend to skip, but anytime you get any real wet, I mean, there's going to be problems with it. Fly, spin, doesn't really matter. So you really do get a smoother drag when the fish is taking line off of a fly reel, and that's something that I personally really do appreciate. Another advantage is you can get way more line on a fly reel. You're putting, if you can get, I should backtrack on that. If you're putting monofilament on a fly reel, this is, just for people who want to make that transition to fly gear and are planning on putting monofilament on it. I mean, fly setups are a whole different thing, and there's also advantages to that. But if you're thinking you want to go to a fly setup with fly line, or if you do want to put monofilament on your reel, which is what I personally do, if you go the monofilament route, you can get a few hundred yards of line on there. Do you need that much? No, absolutely not. If the fish gets more than 100 yards away from you, you're probably not getting it back anyway. But it is nice where if a fish takes out 150 yards of line, you don't have to go back and completely re-spool. You can kind of, if that line breaks off or if it's frayed, cut it off where it is and then just re-tie on with the line you have left, and you don't have to lose your good fishing spot to go re-spool. So some pros and cons with that. And then as far as when a fish is taking line on a spin reel, one thing that happens is you deal with line twist so much more for a couple reasons. Obviously the spool on this, I should just keep it in my hand, is, the diameter of it is much smaller on a spin reel than it is on a fly reel. So if it's being wound more tightly around a smaller, circumference for the spool, it's going to naturally want to coil more on its own anyway. And then when the fish is taking line, so what happens is it comes off of here and goes under your bail right here and then out through your rod. The natural reaction when a fish is taking line is to start reeling. Even if you aren't doing it the whole time and you're doing pump retrieve, at some point you're going to try and reel when that fish is taking line. So your spool is spinning, but then so is your bail. And what happens is the line is coming off of your spool and going through your bail. So there's a tremendous amount of force being put on your line already, the tension on there from your drag, and then what your bail is putting on to try and slow it down. That's what your drag system is. But when you're reeling at the same time, your bail is moving. So picture this, line's coming off of here, so that's force already, but instead of just going through, this roller right here, nice and smoothly like it's supposed to, you're now reeling, so that's tension, and you're creating more friction, which heats your line up and flattens it out. And I don't know if you've ever seen, you could do it with a piece of your hair. If you took a piece of your hair and pinched in between your fingernails and went like this, what happens? Coils up. Or if you've ever seen someone wrapping Christmas presents and they do that thing with the ribbon and the scissors, where they put the friction on it, slide the scissors down, it coils up. That happens to your line too. When you're putting that much force and friction, heat and force on monofilament or fluorocarbon line is going to flatten it out, and that's what creates that pigtail spiral effect, and it just turns into a nightmare. I mean, a lot of times when people come in and they say, the tip of my rod broke off and I have no idea how, I don't say anything as far as like telling them it's their fault, because it's not their fault, but most of the time I know what's happening. You can kind of even look sometimes after time, you'll actually wear a groove in your bail from doing that, you can, but when it creates that pigtail effect and it's coming off the end, instead of coming out straight, when it goes off the end of your rod, because it's spinning, it gets wrapped around the tip of your rod, and then the next time, there's any tension on that, because it's not coming off of the front, because it's wrapped around, snaps off the tip of your rod. And a lot of people don't even realize that that's happening. because I mean, how would you really know? It happens so fast. It's not something that you can see unless you know to pay attention to it. And also, I mean, it can get wrapped around your handle when it's coming off like that and just creates a big mess. So I would say if that's something that you're dealing with often and it's just really frustrating when you're out there, you deal with that line twist, maybe consider switching to a fly reel, rod and reel setup, because that's not something you deal with nearly as much. Another time when I do think a fly reel is an advantage over a spin setup is the ease of getting multiple drifts in. So when you have a fly reel, you can really quickly adjust how far out your line is. You need to take a little in, you can reel in. You want to get out further, you just strip a little more right off of this with your hand, flip it out. I know on my setup, I can get probably 2 full drifts in the same amount of time it takes some of my friends that use a spin setup. I'm not worried about, opening up my bail or flipping it out. I can just pull out however much line I want, flip it out. If I need a little less, I do a couple cranks in. If I need a little more, I strip some out. I don't have to really worry about that. And you can do that with a spin setup, but when you're stripping out, if you're right-handed, so which I am, you would hold the rod in your dominant hand. Typically, you reel with your left hand. So you strip that out, and when you go to flip, all that extra line on a spin reel, because this sticks out so much further, it gets wrapped around your handle and you have to undo it, and it just turns into a giant pain. Where on the fly reel, because the handle is so small, that's not something that you deal with as much. So if you're dealing with line issues frequently, be it getting wrapped around your reel, line twist, anything like that, I would say, and you have a spin setup, maybe consider making that transition to the fly reel just to kind of mitigate that from happening when you're fishing. It really does lessen the amount of time that you spend worrying about your line. Now, again, some of the disadvantages to a fly reel, if we're going to go back to that, are you do only have that one-to-one retrieve. So like me, I'm young, I'm healthy, I rarely fall when I fish, except that little incident a bit ago. We don't talk about that. You learn, you move on, stay humble, everyone. But I can really chase after fish when I want to. So if I have to gain a lot of ground back on the fish quickly, I can reel and run towards that fish, or run upriver or downriver if I have to. Whereas, on a spin reel, if you really can't reel that fast and can't move around too much, it will help you gain your line back quickly. So that is an advantage in that aspect of it. And something that I do really like, occasionally I will switch back to a spin reel steelhead fishing, because they have, anyone who's steelhead fished a lot, they have this trick that they do where the steelhead, you hook a steelhead and it'll take off a million miles an hour downriver, and then all of a sudden your line goes slack and you think, fish off. No. That fish has turned around and is coming back at you a million miles an hour. And if you don't realize that and get your line back in quickly enough and keep the tension on your line, it's gonna go up, and as soon as it takes the slack out of that line and the line, gets taut again, when it hits the end, poop, pops the hook, away it goes. Sad day, no fish for you. So it's easier to gain ground back on the fish with a spin reel that has like a 5 or 6 to 1 retrieve. So when the steelhead's coming back at you, you can reel in a lot faster, which is sometimes something that I like to do. So I still do play around with that. The majority of the time I do use a fly reel, but occasionally I will switch back to spin, just, for advantages of it like that. Another disadvantage of a fly reel, though, is they don't have anti-reverse. So anti-reverse is just when on your spin reel, if you're, the fish is taking line and your bail is spinning, your handle doesn't move, which is why most people do have the urge to grab it and try and reel, because there's nothing telling them, no, don't do that. So I guess you could look at this as an advantage or a disadvantage, depending. But on fly reels, because they are one-to-one, the handle's directly attached to the spool. When drag is being taken, your handle is spinning too, and there's a reason they call these knuckle busters. when that's spinning backwards because the fish is taking line and you go to grab it, you kind of can't. I mean, this is spinning backwards and it'll smash into your knuckles and your thumb and just bash your hand up, which hurts like hell, but also reminds you not to try and reel while the fish is taking drag. So it does kind of help in that way, but it hurts. It's not fun. You know, probably the first couple times I go out in a season, when I hook fish, that's a mistake I make. I immediately just want to like start reeling and I get my hand smashed up. So live and learn, that's something to keep in mind as well. And then I would say another big difference, which this isn't necessarily an advantage or a disadvantage, it's just something to keep in mind. Fly reels, for a decent fly reel that's going to last you a while, do typically cost more than spin reels. I would say you can get a really decent spin reel for under $100. And I do have fly reels in here that are under $100, but for nice ones, especially ones that have a closed drag and bearing system so water can't get in, I mean, you're looking, you know, $150 to $200 starting out for some of those, and then way up from there. On most spin reels, I mean, if, in my opinion, if you're spending more than $200 on a spin reel, it's probably just for show. There's not that many more advantages to them, unless you're using them for different applications like saltwater fishing or something like that, where they're bigger, they're built differently, you need like full metal bodies and, you know, more closed systems so the salt can't get in. But for here, it's not necessary. If you have a decent ball bearing spin reel that's not just made out of plastic and is built, you know, pretty solid, you're really, I mean, only looking at max around $100 or something like that, depending. So that's just something to keep in mind, that spin reels on average do cost considerably less than a fly reel would. So just things to keep in mind. So kind of to recap, if you're thinking of making that transition, just some things to keep in mind. There is a learning curve, just like with everything else on this river and pretty much any other hobby or skill you try and pick up. And I know fly reels seem intimidating. I've heard a lot of people, you know, as soon as I mention, if you thought about a fly setup, before I can even get to showing them that you can put monofilament on there if you want to for what we're doing here, which, let me clarify, that is absolutely not fly fishing, not even close to fly fishing. You have a fly fishing rod and reel, and that's where the similarities end. Nothing about what we're doing with that is fly fishing. And if I'm being honest, even with fly line on there, what we're doing here, unless you're talking about your diehard steelhead fishermen who, you know, are out there and just have a very different setup, pretty much anything to do with the salmon, you're just flipping it out there, even with fly line. Still not necessarily fly fishing, and it doesn't need to be intimidating. It's not particularly difficult. You can make it so if you want to. I mean, you can make anything as complicated as you want, but for the most part, it doesn't have to be. And so it's advantages and disadvantages to both. I personally do like the fly reel setup with monofilament, or I do put fly line on sometimes, just so honestly your hand doesn't get burned up as much on the fly line when you're pulling line out or anything as it does on the mono. So pros, cons, it's going to come down to, it's every person's decision on what they want to do and what they are most comfortable with. We've had people coming here for over 30 years that start out with a spin setup and they never switch from it, and it works great for them. They've had no need to, and that's fine. And it's just, again, every person's preference and what you're comfortable with. At the end of the day, if you're catching fish and you're having fun, I don't care if you're using a little push button Zebco. I just want to see people happy, enjoying themselves out here doing this thing that we all love. And I really think that no matter what your setup you're using, that can be accomplished.